I want to share with you a quote from one of my favorite books to read to my son while I'm putting him to bed. It's a book called The Boy in the Ocean. And in this book, this family takes a trip to the ocean. They take a vacation. And while they're there, the parents are sharing with their son this illustration of God's love. They say these words. They say, God's love is like the ocean. It's always big. It's always here. It never ends. God's love is special. I mean, think about how unfathomably huge the ocean is. And think about what it would do to the human spirit to believe in that type of love. But not just that, but to be the recipient of that type of a love. I believe right now in America, we're facing a moral dilemma. And it's a moral dilemma that not a lot of people realize is even happening because it's kind of underneath the surface of things. I want you to think about it like this. What if I came up to you and I gave you some 2x4s and some nails and I said, okay, I want you to build me a car. You'd have a really tough time building me a car, wouldn't you? Because a car is made out of different material completely. Like in order to build a car, you don't need wood and nails, you need metal and rubber for the tires. You need a different type of material. You cannot construct a car made out of wood. Now, if I went away and I came back and I found that you actually constructed that car, first off, I'd be pretty impressed. But secondly, I think it'd be pretty obvious that you went out and you gathered material that you didn't have in order to construct that car. Now, the moral dilemma that we're facing is we are living in a worldview that's made of metal when we only believe that wood exists. Here's what I mean. For a lot of people in America, they say that God does not exist, that all that exists is the natural world, and that's the only material that they've been given to build their worldview. However, they're living in this metal worldview. They're living in a worldview made of material that you can't get through the natural world. They believe that there is no supernatural God. However, they inhabit these values and this moral way of living that could only come about through the existence of God. Now, if God does not exist, then the only material that you have to build your worldview is the material that's present in the natural world. I mean, you've got cells and atoms and proteins. You've got the building blocks of life, but you've got nothing beyond that. That's all you have to use. Now, science is the study of what is. It's the study of the natural world. And morality and values are the study of what we ought to do with what is. Science is the is, morality and values is the ought. Now, Leslie Newbigin, who's the guy that I quoted earlier, a sociologist, he looked at this topic. And the conclusion that he came to was you can never go from an is to an ought without declaring that there is some sort of greater purpose for the subject that is. Now that's really confusing, so let me break it down like this. You walk into a room and there's a chair in the room. You can make an observation of what is. You can look and you can say there is a chair. Now, if you move from the is to the ought, then you are forced to admit that there is a greater purpose for that chair, that it's not just a hunk of wood with 4 legs. Here's what I mean. When you walk into that room and you say there is a chair, and then you say, and we ought to sit in it. What you're saying is that that chair has a purpose, and its purpose is to be sat in. But if there's a greater purpose for the chair, then there is a higher authority, a higher power that has assigned that thing that purpose. Now, when we walk into the world, when we come into the world, we see that there are lots of things that are here. There's lots of things that are present. We see that there is humanity, and humanity is here. Now, the moment you move from the is to the ought, you declare that there's a greater purpose for humanity, that there's something that humanity ought to do, something that we were created for. So when you come into the world and you say, there is humanity, and humanity ought to live a good life. Humanity ought to treat each other justly and ought to treat each other right. What you're saying is that we live in this world and there's a purpose for why we exist, and that purpose is to be good people. That purpose is to treat each other justly. There's a way that we ought to live. But if there's a greater purpose, then there's also a higher authority that has assigned us that purpose. See, a world without God is a world that is, but a world without God is not a world that has an ought. There's nothing we ought to do. There simply is what is. 2012, there's a Duke philosophy professor named Alex Rosenberg who addressed a series of questions from an atheist perspective. And here's what he said. He was asked this question, is there a God? He said no. So all there is what is. So then the questions go on. It says, what is the nature of reality? What physics says it is? What's the purpose of the universe? There is none. What's the meaning of life? Ditto. Why am I here? Just dumb luck. Does prayer work? Of course not. Is there a soul? Are you kidding me? Is there free will? Not a chance. What happens when I die? Everything pretty much goes on as before, except for us. Is there a difference between right and wrong, good and bad? There is no moral difference between them. Why should I be moral? Because it makes you feel better than being immoral. Is abortion, euthanasia, suicide, paying taxes, foreign aid, or anything else you don't like forbidden, permissible, or sometimes obligatory? And he answered, anything goes. He says, anything goes. What does that mean? He's saying all that exists is what is. There is no way that humanity ought to live. There's no moral obligations. There's no difference between right and wrong. It's just what's practical. Love is just a chemical reaction in your brain. And the disdain that you feel when you hear about slavery and human trafficking, that hatred, that disgust that you feel is just the evolutionary process of your life working itself out. There's nothing beyond this natural world. So when we talk about morality and when we talk about values, what are we talking about? Well, we're talking about a set of oughts, things that humanity ought to do, and these laws that are true for all people throughout all cultures and throughout all of human history. So my question to you is, do you believe that that type of morality exists? Well, most people do. In fact, 99.999% of the world does. And so let me ask it like this. Do you believe that murder is wrong for all people throughout all cultures, throughout all of human history? Do you believe that slavery is wrong for all people throughout all cultures, throughout all of human history? Well, if you say yes, then honestly, you're kind of in this place where you have to agree that God exists, and here's why. Think about it like this. You come home one day and your kids are just nagging you. They're like, hey, we need to get a dog. And so finally you just give in. You're like, okay, we'll get a dog. So you drive the minivan down to the pound and you go to the pound and you're looking at all these dogs and you find the most adorable little dog. It's sweet, it's fluffy, and it's white. And so you name him Fluffy. You bring him home to the kids and you sit the kids down. You say, okay, there's 2 rules for Fluffy. Number 1, Fluffy cannot jump on the couch. And number 2, Fluffy can't go potty in the house. He has to go in the backyard. So the kids train Fluffy, and over time, Fluffy learns to obey the rules. He doesn't jump on the couch, and he doesn't go potty inside. Now, alternative scenario, that day that you're driving to the pound, Fluffy gets out of the pound, he escapes, and he becomes a homeless dog on the streets. And he finds an abandoned house, and he lives in that abandoned house. The question I would ask you is, does Fluffy jump on that couch, and does Fluffy go potty in the house? Well, of course he does, right? Because there are no rules in that house. There were only rules in the house where there was a ruler of the house, because rules are the direct result of a ruler of the house. And so we live in this house, we live in this world. And so when you come into this world and you look around, the question that you have to ask yourself is there a ruler of the house? Well, if we observe that there are rules of their house, then there must be a ruler of the house, because the rules of the house are a direct result of the ruler of the house. You do not get a law without a lawgiver. You don't get rules without a ruler of the house existing. Now, if you want to construct a worldview that includes living a life of love and fighting injustice and fighting for justice, if you want to have a worldview that includes embodying this greater meaning and this greater purpose, your worldview has to include God. And I want to pause here really quickly, because I think it's really important to say that it's not that you can't be a loving person. It's not that you can't have a greater meaning and purpose in your life. It's not that you can't fight injustice. In fact, I would say that there are a lot of people that don't believe in God that are really great people, phenomenal people, that have done a lot of good in the world. And there's a lot of Christians out there that are really miserable and terrible people, people that you really want to hang out with. And so I want you to know, like, I completely get that. All I'm saying is, if you want a rational worldview, if you want a worldview that's rational, that includes values and morals, it has to be a worldview that comes from God. Alan Alan Lightman, who's an MIT professor, he talks about agnosticism like this. He says, our consciousness and our self-awareness create an illusion that we are made of some special substance, that we have some kind of special ego power, some I-ness, some unique existence. But in fact, we are nothing but bones, tissues, gelatinous membranes. Can we just pause there? Like, can we work that word into like our normal vocabulary? Because I kind of feel like a gelatinous membrane after 2020, all that time in quarantine. But he goes on, he says, we're just tissues, bones, gelatinous membranes, neurons, electrical impulses, and chemicals. So just like you can't construct a car out of wooden nails, you can't construct a worldview that includes morals and values without God. You cannot go from morals and values from gelatinous membranes. You can't get that. It's not a logical progression. So when you look at the natural world and you look at what a person that doesn't believe in God has to use in order to construct their worldview, it's really not a lot. Now I want you to think about what the Christian has, the type of resources that a Christian has to actually build their worldview. I mean, I have an all-loving, all-powerful, all-knowing God of the universe that created everything that you see here in a simple word. I have a God that desires a relationship with every single person on this planet. I have a God that the Bible says is rich in grace and rich in mercy. I serve a God who in Psalm chapter 97 says that God's foundation of his throne is righteousness and justice. So in other words, God is right in everything that he does, and God is just in every decision that he makes. And so if I want to construct a worldview that includes love, justice, and meaning, well, all I have to do is draw upon the resources that I have in my relationship with God. I've got a God that loves me, that cares about me, and so I just emulate that love. I've got a God who's just, so I emulate that justice. And I've got a God that's writing this story of my life, so I just step into that beautiful story that God is creating in me. But the cool thing about God is that God's not just somebody who helps us build a worldview. He's actually a God that helps us live in that world. And I think one of the problems is we build these worldviews that include morality and justice, but we don't have the character mechanisms that help us actually live out that morality and that justice. And so we live in this place of shame. The cool thing is I've got a God of grace that allows me to make mistakes and he forgives me, but he also gives me the power to embody this morality, this value that he's given me in this life.